Welcome to the Impactful Speakers series. Uh, it's a pleasure to host this webinar and event in collaboration with the World Bank. When we talk about climate change, I think normally the tendency is to think about the food, water, energy nexus, or we think about the accelerated melting and the resultant disasters through flooding or drought and desertification and their implications. But we usually don't make the connection between climate change and violence. This is something new, and this is a study that has come up, which we need to go into greater depth and detail to discuss with our specialists today. I think it's becoming increasingly evident that there is no sector and there's no aspect of life that is spared by climate change. And the linkage between climate change and gender-based violence is also now coming to the fore. In the recent past, there have been research studies that have been conducted by IUCN and CARE International that make this connection very clear. When we look at the demographics of Pakistan, we see that nearly 50% of our population constitutes of women. When we look at the population of the region, we also see that half the regional population, nearly 48%, consists of women. Most of these women work in the agriculture sector, and due to disasters, there are a lot of dislocations and out-migrations that are taking place. This increases the vulnerability of women. So today we are very fortunate to have with us an expert group of panelists who will look into these different aspects of what are the existing laws that we have in the country and the region to protect women, and what are the recommendations that we need from them to propose to policymakers to make the necessary measures and put them in place. As climate change intensifies, these aggravations will also increase, and more women will become vulnerable to violence as well as to sexual abuse. We have with us BENAZIR JATOI, who's going to serve as the moderator for this session. BENAZIR is a very passionate lawyer, and she focuses and emphasizes on issues related to gender and minorities and governance and legal issues. So to get a deeper insight into the different issues that will affect women and will be linked to violence and sexual abuse, I will pass this conversation to BENAZIR to take it forward and discuss it with our panelists. I'm hoping, BENAZIR, that while you moderate the panel, you will also share your views with us, where you think we stand and what is it that we need to do to take this process forward to secure and provide greater protection to women. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yeah.
Yes. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Good evening, depending on where you're sitting at the moment. We are globally and in Pakistan celebrating the 16 days of activism. So this couldn't be a more timely panel discussion. And I think the Civil Society Coalition for Climate Change and the World Bank have actually been pioneers in recognizing, though there's been a little bit of work, but recognizing and bringing to the forefront in Pakistan the nexus between, like Aisha has already mentioned, climate, gender, and violence. Something we often forget. And in a time where we are in unprecedented times, such as COVID, a combination of the emergency that is climate change and a global pandemic, stark inequalities are coming to light. And I think the focus here between gender and violence and the emergency around climate, our nexus we need to establish further and then take forward and voice and advocate with policymakers and lawmakers within Pakistan, but also globally. So I am excited actually to be monitoring this and to be moderating this and to listen to these amazing panelists who I'm actually quite excited by and their work. So without further ado, I just saw Babar Saab leave the panel. Am I right in thinking he's back? Because I was going to call him my first panel.
Yeah. Benazir,
Okay,
Benazir, can you
wonderful.
hear me? Assalamu
I can
alaikum.
hear you.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
can hear
that's
you.
yes. Yeah.
So let
Actually, I'm
me, Babar
traveling,
Saab, let
so
me
yeah, yeah. Please.
let me go through the formality of introducing you, though I am in awe of your work. So I don't need any introduction, but there are many people here who may um, want to know exactly where you are placed in all of this. And also, as a formality for the panel, let me introduce you first and put a question to you before you speak. But I just like to say that we will give each panelist 5 to 7 minutes to speak. So if I interrupt you, I'm not being rude. I'm just going with the format of the way I'm required to conduct this panel. And then we would like to open the floor for questions and comments from the audience as well, so we can make it as inclusive as possible, with the aim of taking forward some recommendations and some real foresight for future planning, both for the World Bank and the coalition. So Babar Bashir is the executive director of ROSEN, which is a Pakistani national NGO that works on self-awareness, violence against women. They have helplines as well, but they do a lot of engagement with men and boys around awareness, masculinity, and violence. And Babar Saab is actually quite a pioneer in that area and has worked extensively in it and for years. And like I said, he's a mentor for a lot of us that work in this area. So Babar Saab, I'd like to ask you specifically, what role can men and boys play in reducing gender-based violence? We know the UN has a lot of focus on the engagement and involvement of men to end violence, but within the nexus of climate and gender, especially climate where it's beyond just looking at it from a gender perspective, what's the role that men can play in reducing violence? And what should government, civil society stakeholders do differently to ensure protection of women and girls and children in emergencies and humanitarian action? And how can this be measured? So over to you, Babar Saab.
Thank you so much, Benazir, for these, I think, wonderful introductory words, and so kind of you, the organizers of the webinar. Actually, I'm traveling, I'm on the motorway, so quite possible there's some kind of a disruption. Therefore, I'm not putting my video on as well, because this may affect the quality of the, I think, conversation. So thank you. I think just to respond to the question, I think this is very, very pertinent, specifically when we talk about how to address the issue of gender-based violence, and specifically violence against women and girls. I feel like there is a kind of a growing need and growing kind of a demand across the world, specifically when we talk about the prevention side of violence against women and girls. Like, without engaging men and boys, we really can't achieve this goal. So there's a realization and lot of work that has been on the ground for many years, specifically on the response side, that has also informed us, like, we have to work on the prevention side. And when we say prevention side, of course, role of men and boys is very, very pertinent in that side. Secondly, over the years, I think we have learned, specifically from our own work with the communities, uh, like, we have to look violence in a perspective, like how we can stop it from happening first time. Because we know once the cycle of violence starts, it really becomes more difficult to really break it. And especially when we talk about intimate partner violence or domestic violence. So how we can stop it from happening it from the first time? And of course, we have to work on the prevention side. And we know this is unfortunate, but this is the fact, like, these are the men and boys, and specifically men, who are the perpetrators of violence against women and girls across the world. And just, if you, I mean, I see it in another way, like, if when global data informs us, out of three, one woman and girl face violence across world from, and most of the time these are the men, and these are the people who they know. So one way is like looking at, okay, there are, and we know about this whole OBR, the 1 billion rising campaign that talks about like how important it is to count the voices of all the women and girls survivors of violence. But so if you look at the data from the reverse side, if 1 million women are facing violence, so it means 1 million men and boys are actually the perpetrators. And if 1 million are perpetrators and out of the total population, so what are the other men and boys are doing? Where they are? What actually they are doing? Where they are seen? What actually what they are doing actually? Either they are silent. If all men are not violent, so we can inference that most of men are silent. And if they're silent and they're not talking about the issue, what they are doing? They are just bystanders. They are just indifferent. They feel they have nothing to do this with this issue. Or there are men where we feel like they feel no, this is their issue as well. It's not issue of like violence against women is an issue of only women, but this is issue of men as well. And and here is actually I think where we at times struggle as well. But here is the buy-in as well, like how when we say we really want a society and a family which is violence free, and we really want to work with we say okay, we want a family which is a happy family. And how come we can say a happy family where violence is happening? And if there is violence is happening, how can we say like the men who are living in that family are not getting affected? So if it's one way is like they are the perpetrators, but at the same time being a perpetrator, but as the witness of violence, they are also getting affected basically. So they have to come out and they play their role basically. So this is the basic premises. I feel like when we say it is important to work with men and boys, like they have the role basically. Secondly, you have very well said, like we have to look at from a perspective of when we say like the issue of violence and locating masculinities into the issue of gender-based violence basically. Because I mean, working for so many years and specifically in the context of Pakistan, we have found like uh, the whole way the men are socialized and the boys are socialized in our context. I mean, most of the patriarchal context, but in our context specifically. So one way they have to show up and they have to say like they are real men, real boys, is they have to be violent. So to just to perform their masculinity, just to prove themselves they are a real man, they are real boys, they resort to become violent basically. And our experience specifically with young men and boys, and I do ask this question like, do you know like this just happened to them? Are they really realize why they do this basically? And honestly, many times they do not have any answer basically why they do this. Just at times this happen to them. And we know in our context specifically, like it's the issue of power structure as well. And in this context where we know men and boys have more power as compared to women in our women and girls. But at the same time, the way they see themselves, I feel like they are not really able to. I mean, it's not giving them a kind of a room like the of their actions. No, not at all. If a man is violent, he is responsible for his action basically. But I feel like many times, specifically when we work with men and young men and provide them a spaces where they talk about their own way, the way they look at the issue basically, and where they locate themselves in the issue, and how the kind of burden they carry of being a real man basically and being a real boy basically, and how actually it is affecting their own mental and emotional health. So I see here is the real kind of you can say connecting point basically, where in our experience we have found like we have to link the whole issue of violence against women with not only with men and boys in a way where they can connect it with their own self basically, and whole way this is, and this connection is basically can provide them a kind of a way forward, the role they can play basically over a period. And secondly, I feel, I mean, just to because just in terms of the time, I know you are nodding and just quickly moving to the next question. My take is like we really need to reflect overall the work we have been doing on the issue of gender equality and gender-based violence in Pakistan and across the world. My feeling is our work, I mean, of course, we have come a long way. I mean, we really feel proud of it and being part of the movement. But still, there are some fundamental issues. I feel like one is like really asking ourselves, really the work that we are doing for so many years and decades is transformatory in true sense. I mean, I take the responsibility. I say yes, no. Our work has not been really transformatory over the years. And when I say transformatory, I define it in a two ways basically. One is looking at our work from a purely power structure. Like, okay, really the work that we do, and specifically when I say talk about men and boys, basically, it's okay. Like we really feel very happy when men report them. They are supporting in their domestic cause. They are supporting their families in child rearing. But we know many men who do this, but at the same time they are violent. So it's not only it's just not enough. Like, okay, just to bring them on board and asking them and expecting from them, like, okay, they support the domestic code. Basically, we have to really really they are ready to share the power at the domestic level, the power at the society level, basically. So this is one aspect of that work that I feel really we have been not really able to achieve that. Yeah. You want to say something, Benzi?
I don't, I just conscious of the time. So
Okay,
I'll
the
let
second
you
point.
wrap
Yeah.
up.
Yes, of course. The second point is either our work has been really changing the norms that are discriminatory. We know the norms that are biased, the norms that are the norms and the beliefs that are actual the root causes of the all form of violence that we see in our society, basically. So the power structure and changing and shifting norms. These have been the real kind of a challenges for us over the years. Thank you, Benzi.
Thank you so much for such an enlightened. Sorry, I rushed you, and I know that these things can be a little bit haphazard because there's a lot more to say, and your experience is so vast. But I think you summed it up really well. If they're not violent, if men are not violent, then are they silent? And I think that really is saying a lot. And also, the issue is not just around and about women, because it's the men that actually are violent. So the 1 in 3 figure of the World Bank, I believe it is, only looks at the side of the survivor, the victim, but also who is carrying that out are men. So looking at it from that angle is really important. And I'm so glad that you brought in terms of the kind of work we've done and where we failed. Has it really been transformatory? Asking ourselves those questions. Have we addressed power structures? Have we looked at norms? Have we really changed those? And has change really been beneficial for the ultimate beneficiary, which is the survivor? So this has been wonderful, and I'm glad that we asked you to speak first, because you kind of set an agenda that it's wider than just for women. Because often my criticism is that when we speak only to or for men, will they be the gatekeepers? But I think you've summed it up well, that actually, no, they're part of the problem and they're part of the solution. So thank you for that, which I think takes me naturally to my next panelist, which is UZMA QURESH from the World Bank. Because I think that we're saying that everyone is involved in terms of gender and violence and climate. So how do we integrate women from the real start to ask questions around climate and to be part of the solution? UZMA QURESH, I'm sure in this panel doesn't need an introduction, but as a formality, I have to go through this. So UZMA QURESH is working with the World Bank Group Pakistan office and is a social development specialist, and has been there and has over 14 years of experience on gender equality and women's empowerment. And she has worked with various organizations, presently at the World Bank, but we know she's been with the UN, and she's looked at the UN Women Uganda portfolio on women's economic empowerment, and has done a lot of work, authored a lot of work, spoken up as a strong advocate for gender equality. So Uzma, I'd like to ask you specifically, how is the region progressing on its international obligation towards gender mainstreaming into climate action? So specifically into climate action, and what are the key challenges and solutions at play for South Asia on this subject? Also, what are the mechanisms for active stakeholder participation among women at all levels of society? Over to you, Uzma.
Thanks, BENAZIR. So it's a lot of questions, but I'll try to be as brief as possible. As I think as most of us know, gender has been identified as one of the critical areas to address during international climate change deliberations, because Aisha also mentioned in the beginning that global literature, it shows that during climate-related disasters, women are the ones who bear the most disproportionate brunt of disaster impacts due to pervasive gender inequality and stereotypes across South Asian societies. Coming back to the climate change gender action plans, the enhanced LIMA work program on gender and its gender action plan, it was adopted at COP25, and it has 5 priority areas on gender, which also includes capacity building and awareness of women, creating gender balance in decision-making forums, promoting women's leadership, gender responsive implementation of national and local programs, and monitoring and evaluation of interventions. So South Asian countries, they have made efforts in developing their climate change gender action plans. Pakistan's national climate change policy also makes a reference to pro-poor gender sensitive adaptation and mitigation. But the implementation of these action plans and policies, it's entirely missing. It's not happening adequately in the region. And I mean, I wish I had some substantive things to report here, but gender and climate change has yet to really register the way environmental degradation or prospects for growth in climate change they have so far. But a lot needs to be done on this front. One of the key challenges that South Asian policymakers have been highlighting, and governments have also been raising it on various forums, is that they lack sector-specific, sex-disaggregated data still on climate change. And this could inform their policy-making processes also to improve women's voice and agency. In addition, issues related to agriculture, water, and transport sectors, which are, by the way, the most impacted sectors by climate change, and they can play a critical role in building resilience. But their strategies and policies, they are not gender inclusive. Especially, I mean, I will give you example of Pakistan. They don't have adequate implementation plans either to address gender gaps in these areas. So secondly, if you look at traditional decision-making forums in agriculture and water sectors in Pakistan, they are primarily male-dominated, such as farmers' organizations and water users associations. Women's representation in national and provincial livelihoods programs is also still not adequately integrated. And this results in interventions that are not prioritizing women's inclusion in jobs, creation and livelihoods restoration opportunities in different sectors, especially in these sectors. So you asked me about solutions, and I think they will require zeroing in on these challenges in sex disaggregated data generation, gender inclusive policies, women's representation in decision-making forums, and also their participation in different programs. I'll give you example of few projects also that are working to address some of these gaps. A recent World Bank Finance South Asia level project that will be focusing on agriculture, water and transport sectors in Nepal, Bangladesh and Pakistan. It will make efforts to support countries to translate the COP25 commitments on gender and the national climate change gender action plans commitments also into sectoral strategies and investment plans. So the project will support generating, of course, sex disaggregated data, such as on vulnerabilities and on hotspots, which will then be incorporated into the new and existing sectoral strategies and guidelines in these 3 countries. And World Bank will also be supporting through its various operations in Pakistan and different provinces, the development of gender inclusive provincial agriculture and water policies, And possibly in some areas, we will also try to support the governments in amending some legislations to ensure women's concerns are considered, such as their representation in decision-making forums. In addition, these sex disaggregated data analytics will also inform the design of different programs that will be developed as part of South Asia DRM and climate change portfolio. One of Pakistan government's programs on climate change is Green Stimulus Package. I'm sure most of you are aware of that. It aims to create 200,000 green jobs through greater involvement of communities, including women and youth. I don't have the disaggregated number. KP's economic recovery plan, it emphasizes resilience and commits to allocating 30% jobs for women in various sectors. But implementation, like I said, it remains to be seen, but intent is there. So World Bank financed Sindh Resilience Project that has again, just been approved. It will focus on creating jobs for women in the construction sector. Another project that is being financed by World Bank in Karachi, BRT project, that integrates climate change adaptation and mitigation measures. It has allocated 30% jobs for women at the institutional level, for example, in Sindh Mass Transit Authority and on bus platforms to create enabling environment for women and other gender minorities. One of UN programs by FAO, with the governments of Punjab and Sindh is to transform agriculture in the basin area in both Punjab and Sindh by increasing resilience among the most vulnerable farmers, including women farmers. Again, I don't have sex disaggregated data to see that out of 1.6 million beneficiaries, how many will be women farmers. So we need many more such initiatives from the private sector, from CSOs and from government with clear substantive gender targets that are mostly missing at this point. And we also need strong M&E systems and community-based mobilization strategies to ensure women get the opportunities to benefit from available and upcoming green livelihoods and jobs programs. And they also become part of awareness raising interventions to protect themselves and their families from disasters in the aftermath of disasters or to prevent them. And their voices are also heard on all levels. So we need these actions to be done before. So to your second point, I think organizing women into groups at the grassroots level is critical, because in the coming years, the vulnerability of grassroots communities because of climate change, it will only increase. So it becomes very important to build the resilience of communities to natural shocks and protect them, protect the progress that they have made so far. And if you look at South Asia region, it has made some very, it has witnessed some very successful initiatives to empower rural women. For example, in India, a long-term partnership between the national and state governments, and World Bank was also a partner. It helped more than 50 million women into self-help groups and their federations. And this brought huge change in the lives of poor rural communities, including economic empowerment of women. In Bangladesh, I'm sure you all know, BRAC is an international development organization that works in more than 69,000 villages, and it has 4.9 million borrowers, and an overwhelming majority, 87% of them, they are women. In Pakistan, we also see several civil society organizations. They have been organizing women informal workers, such as national and provincial rural support networks, HomeNet Pakistan, etc. They have been promoting better livelihoods opportunities and improving women's access to leadership skills. There are some South Asia level platforms also. For example, one is on women's economic empowerment, which was established, I think if the name was BEES, Business Enterprise and Employment Support. It consists of, at the moment, I think more than 25 facilitating organizations. It still needs, a lot of expansion, and it's working on, resilient livelihoods for women informal workers. We also have HomeNet South Asia that represents home-based workers organizations across the region. So I think we need to capitalize on these existing grassroots groups, informal workers associations, And we also need more local, national, and regional level platforms to highlight climate change issues and develop resilience. And also at the same time to boost women's access to decision-making forums and climate resilient livelihoods options. A local government structure in Pakistan can work very well in this case. In fact, in South Asia and many countries, this can work because they have women's representatives. And this can play a key role in enhancing women's voice and agency on climate change forums by working with community-based organizations and women groups. Just like in India, they did this massive community mobilization to also implement climate change gender action plans. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Uzma, you packed so much in. I'm not sure that I can actually sum up anything that you actually said, but I'll try. Thank you, because that gave a lot of detail around the kind of World Bank projects that are going on within Pakistan and in the region. Also, I think saying what a lot of times, a lot of us say is, yes, on paper, there is commitment regionally, nationally, but actually implementation is slow, whether it's gender-based violence specifically, whether it's climate, whether it's a combination of, and the interplay between that. But I think World Bank has actually been a leader in recognizing within the region and globally, the interplay between gender and climate change. And I think you highlighted how there are more projects within Pakistan coming up, for example, in Karachi, recognizing women in certain jobs. I think the challenge will always be implementation. How do we make sure that 30% quota for women, how do we actually make sure that's actually utilized, actually goes forward, how effective it is, etc. And I'm glad that you talked about how we actually need more data, that we don't have enough, and I think in all areas, around climate, around gender, around violence, data is missing. But again, something very close to my heart, so I remember that you said this, is local government. And then the role local government can play actually for Pakistan's democracy, and on issues such as climate and gender, how it comes together. And I think that really kind of ties it up. But thank you again for also mentioning that traditional decision-making, which is such a huge part of Pakistani society and structures, formal and informal, how it hasn't fully recognized the gender aspect of things. I think some of it may exist, but we don't record it. And a lot of the other times it doesn't exist at all. So thank you for mentioning that, because I think it's such an important part of how we actually solve the issue on climate and bringing women forward. So thank you very much for that. I'd like to now go to my next panelist, who is HISKA Reyes. And if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, just let me know once I'm done speaking. HISKA is a senior social development specialist in South Asia with a social, urban, rural, and resilience global practice. She works on gender and social inclusion at the bank and is currently coordinating the global Women Evolve initiative. So over to you. No, actually, no, not over to you, because I have a question for you. And the question actually, which is quite timely, because we have one emergency, which is the climate emergency. We have another pandemic or crisis, which is gender-based violence. But the third pandemic or the crisis really is COVID-19. So in a way, the world has been bound by three very important issues. So how has COVID-19 changed the landscape of gender-based violence in the development work? What were some of the key challenges? What are any good practices for tackling gender-based violence in the context of COVID? And I'd just like to add to this, has COVID made gender and gender-based violence take a back seat? Because the focus is so much now on COVID, some of the other issues have kind of been pushed to the sideline. So over to you.
Thank you, BENAZIR. So what we've seen really across the region, but also across the globe with the COVID pandemic, is that it's exacerbated gender, but also GBV issues that we were facing pre-pandemic. No, before the pandemic, there was a lack of adequate resources for GBV programs. Now there's been a shift in resources toward COVID response, and resources that were dedicated to GBV have been cut further. We've also seen a shift in service provision from in-person to helplines because of the quarantine and lockdown measures that have been implemented in so many countries. But this shift has only been done by service providers that have been able to prepare and implement adequate COVID protocols or have the necessary human and technical resources to shift their services to digital platforms. We know that not all women have the necessary infrastructure or even the privacy to access these services that they're conducted now over the phone or online. Women before the pandemic also had issues with mobility, and this continues to be the case. So there are issues with women who are traveling to the services that are still operating in person. This can place them at risk of contracting the virus, but also violating lockdowns and quarantine measures. In the bank, we have recognized the need to ensure continuity of service provision and mitigate risks of sexual exploitation and abuse in our COVID emergency response projects. So with this in mind, we looked at available guidance on integrating gender, but also looking at GBV in our COVID operations. And we have we've identified 4 good practices that we are pushing our operations, especially the COVID response operations, to follow. The first is to increase funding for service provision. Now, be that those service providers that have been able to shift from in-person to helpline, these may need some support to have the necessary technical or digital platforms. But there are service providers that are still operating in person. And there have been also some non-traditional service providers. So we have community groups, so we have women's groups that are now stepping in and providing some GBV support measures. These service providers need support in developing standard operating procedures that can also allow them to operate during the lockdowns. But they may also need PPE, they may also need, say, transport options. So we need to really identify which service providers are operating, what modalities they're operating in, and what are their needs. And once we know this, then we should integrate them into our financing options. Second, this is a time also for in particular, the COVID response operations to integrate basic GBV risk mitigation measures. And what we mean by this is having a GBV incident response, looking at codes of conduct. If these don't include any measures against GBV, then this is a time to revise those policies and ensure that there are some codes of conduct that are providing protocols for GBV, so how people operate. Third, we recognize that traditional referral pathways have been disrupted. We see from outside South Asia, for example, in Europe, that non-traditional service providers have been stepping in. We have examples from Italy of people actually going to pharmacies, and the pharmacy has been the place where they have been able to get some information on what services are available. So it's while we're thinking about the referral pathways to deal with COVID positive individuals, we should examine how we can integrate GBV service providers into this, including those non-traditional services or groups that are now stepping in as frontline service providers. This again includes local groups, local community groups who may not have the necessary capacity to deal with these issues, but find themselves in a situation where they have to respond. And finally, we do also propose that programs embed, the COVID response programs embed GBV messaging into the pandemic communication. So while these messages are around COVID prevention or response, or identifying where people can go for testing and how they can prevent themselves from contracting the virus, that these are also opportunities to embed GBV messaging, not just on raising awareness that this is an issue, as we'll see that there are rising tensions in the household, but also where people can go to help, but also looking more at the behavior of messaging. What sort of coping mechanisms can be imparted through these communication channels? This would be important. Before I answer your other question, I also want to give an example of how we are integrating some of these good practices in our operations in the bank. In particular, in Sri Lanka, our COVID emergency response operation is expanding the GBV care centers across the health system in Sri Lanka, including expansion of psychosocial support and community outreach to women and children experiencing domestic violence. The project is also integrating GBV messages into their pandemic response communications, but they're doing so by targeting vulnerable groups, including women, children, the elderly, disabled people, and people who don't speak Sinhala or have or live in remote locations and don't have access to mainstream media. And finally, the project is also including GBV into the protocols that are going to be followed in quarantine and isolation centers, so that we recognize that this could also be a point of risk for women and children. And your question, can you repeat your last question again, please? The one that you've added. You're muted.
Yeah, that all happens often, doesn't it, when you're speaking and you realize that you're not speaking to anyone. Basically, have these issues of climate and gender-based violence, have they taken a back seat because of COVID? I mean, has the world commitment of countries taken the focus away from these other very urgent issues as well?
So this was a risk in the beginning of the pandemic, but I think that the development community, including the World Bank, really we've learned from past pandemics, including the Ebola crisis. And so we have taken lessons from those programs. We have developed guidance notes and toolkits and other resources so that we can integrate a focus on GBV and on gender in our COVID response. So for example, on gender, we're seeing our projects that are providing now the second wave of COVID response projects that are providing conditional cash transfers are looking and including measures that are targeting women and ensuring that especially women, informal workers or female-headed households are targeted. We're looking at also the distribution mechanisms for food and vouchers to ensure that these are also including, these are safe spaces, that there's messaging on GBV. So I think that we have learned from past crises and we have been able to integrate that into the COVID emergency response operations and the post recovery efforts.
Thank you so much for that. Precise and answering the question specifically to what we asked around COVID. I think what we've recognized is, and especially from your conversation, what's come out is that we need to reimagine a lot of things around how we handle different crises. So to say that non-traditional actors have stepped up, is it because we failed to recognize them as actors in the first place? I think we need to ask ourselves this question, because BABAR set the kind of tone in that sense that we need to ask ourselves, have we made a difference? Has our work made a difference to women and to climate and women together? Have we recognized that? And have we addressed violence in the way we should to allow a violent-free society for everyone? And I think perhaps we haven't been imaginative enough in terms of messaging around both gender-based violence, but also around climate, for people to take responsibility, for countries to take responsibility, and how we tap into resources within societies to allow for change to happen. Thank you for the example of Sri Lanka. Actually, that's quite interesting, that expansion of services, inclusiveness, but perhaps also going to UZMA's point that SARC is a platform within the region that we haven't utilized in the same way around climate. And can we utilize SARC? I know there's a lot of political issues around SARC as well, and it's not as effective as platform as it can be, but perhaps climate is something that can bind us. Gender-based violence is something that can bind us and take us beyond the political kind of messy politics of the region. And I will stop speaking now and move on to my next panelist, who I'm very happy is on our panel, FAUZIA Malik. Ms. Malik is currently working as the manager, Islamabad Program Office of the IUCN, and has a lot of work in areas of gender and women's empowerment. She's worked previously with Human Resource Development Network and the Catholic Relief Services. But interestingly, she has a master's degree in forestry and social forestry from Peshawar University, and has also has a master's degree from the University of Agriculture in Faisalabad. So I'm glad to welcome her to the panel. And specifically, Ms. Fauzia, I'd like to ask you that the degradation of nature can lead to gender-based violence, including sexual assault, domestic violence, and forced prostitution, according to the IUCN study. What are the linkages you find in your work between gender-based violence, climate change, and environment? And how is the region progressing on its international obligations towards mainstreaming gender into climate action? What are the challenges that are faced, and how can we better improve it? I know a lot of questions to ask in only 7 minutes. You have 7 minutes to answer, so over to you.
Thank you, BENAZIR. I've been actually listening to all the speakers, and I think interesting points are coming in, and it's quite a good connection that is building on. As we understand, gender-based violence itself is not a simple concept or simple issue, but this link with the environmental issues is quite complex and kind of multi-layered also, because it relates to the human rights as well as the healthy ecosystems. Because at times there's a balance and there's a difficult connection also. But there's a lot of a lot of discriminatory norms and laws which are there, and in our society there's a lot of means for controlling and exploiting the whole strengths. What we basically have been working on, looking at the overall gender discrimination and gender inequality in all different work that we have been doing on the environmental component also. Initially, in most of the programs and projects in Pakistan, at the national level, there has been challenge in incorporating or in adding women to those programs and giving them those opportunities for them to actually become the partners. There has been some success, but we have been always short on numbers. There has not been much data available, and that is one big factor. And if we see at the reports of the global reports, we only see Pakistan at a very lower end. Though if we look at the reality, because of this being short on the numbers, we can't even reflect what we actually have. There is a lot that has been done. There has been a lot of challenges, though there have been a lot of opportunities also. IUCN's Global Program on Governance and Rights, they've been working at the global level, and we have been working on developing the climate change gender action plan in more than 23 countries that we have already developed. And now in Pakistan, we are working on that under the Green Climate Fund. There's a readiness grant which has been provided by the Green Climate Fund for the purpose to actually mainstream this in the current policies. Like particularly the base of this is the National Climate Change Policy. That is where we are focusing on, and on the implementation framework that we are currently working on to basically develop a climate change gender action plan for Pakistan. Now that we've already started working on sectoral analysis for some of the key sectors, including energy, including agriculture, water, these are some of the key sectors where we are health, obviously. So this is the line where we are currently working on. So first we need that data where we can actually assess and build on that action plan and involve all the different actors, all the different stakeholders in that process at the national level to actually implement those actions into the whole mainstreaming the whole system. Currently, I mean, most of the projects, and as we see, we have talked about different programs and projects at the World Bank, at the government level. They have been trying to incorporate, but again, the gap of the data that we don't really, we can't get much out of it unless we have that data available. And then, I mean, as we were talking about in the current COVID-19 outbreak, the pressure, as we know, we understand, and we all of us have been facing as well, that the pressure, the pressure at household level has increased. There has been a lot of more responsibility. Women are already disproportionately responsible for most of the household duties, but then the pressure due to the quarantines and the lockdowns and the new challenges for the livelihood that increased, and that also resulted in more the domestic violence and more pressure on women for managing at the last level. So this has been quite a, I would say, in a way, it's stigmatized also. That has increased the pressure looking at the overall scenario in Pakistan and probably in many other countries also. But Pakistan and other Asian countries are more of an example because it has been the culturally we are on a difficult path already, and so this in fact resulted in reducing the livelihood opportunities for women, and the women's empowerment path that we had sort of initiated or we were working on, I think retreated us on that, because the women now have reduced opportunities, reduced income, and due to more workload at the household level and the increased violence also, the paradigm has changed for them in many ways, because there's a challenge and the frustration frustration and the anxiety that has increased. It impacted more for women. So it's a quite a complex thing, and then also understanding the time frame. We don't know actually how long it is going to be. So it is also causing a lot of panic, unpredictability that is there. So I think some of these things, the overall exploitation, as we understand that there's a whole connection in that. And then I mean, looking at the overall, I mean, some of the aspects that we could see when there was a lot of lockdowns, probably temporarily, the environment, the nature started breathing a bit. But that was I mean, there's much more research that is required on that aspect, but it impacted us for a short period. It impacted the nature in a positive manner, but made us realize where we are lacking also. I think some of the aspect, the second part of your questions was that we need to actually prepare, get more information. When I say there's a requirement for the data, for the information that has to be there, because only then we can appropriately respond or help out the people. Then we need to actually document, and if there are gender-based violence issues, then we need to collect data and also basically document appropriately so the responses can be done. With respect to the overall overall monitoring and the tools for different stakeholders to have those guidelines to actually assess and support. Capacity building at all levels, particularly I would say at the government levels, it has to really be a big focus that we really require, because the first thing is they don't see it. They don't see that there's a difference. They don't understand. It has to be mainstream, and we have initiated the process through this Climate Change and Action Plan program. We have already initiated this process to assess the projects that have been and that are built on the climate change aspect. So to assess and see where there are gaps and where it needs to be done. I would say, these actions are really important when we address in the wake of our policies that are there. So we are looking at the national climate change policy to be that guide. Just a few.
If I can just ask you to just wrap up.
Just the wrap up. I think I'll just put in some of the key points. We need to focus on the capacity building at different levels. Then we have to also provide some expert support by the existing experts that we have. We are building in that program also. We need to have the guiding tools and to be provided also. We need to focus on the budgeting, because that's very important aspect for gender responsive budgeting in the programs and the projects and the initiatives that government is taking. If there's data available, that becomes the basis for the planning and support the policy implementation and the development. And then this coordination that we're currently looking at, I think that's also very important. And donors are already understanding this, and it's quite an important aspect. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you for focusing on, at the end, just summing it up. So focus on capacity building, expert support, budget. We commit to so many things. When there's no money, then you're not actually walking your talk. And coordination, which sometimes can be the actual reason that things aren't moving forward. But I think you've reiterated also what UZMA has also pointed out: lack of data doesn't exist, and the areas in which gender and climate intersect, whereas energy, agriculture, water within our region, but in Pakistan specifically. So thank you for kind of shining a light on that, and saying it so well that actually livelihood opportunities for women has reduced because the pressure of their household and the dual burden of care work has increased, violence has increased, so that psychological effect is really important to point out, because yes, we don't have a time frame. Yes, there's some promise of vaccines in the future, but where do we stand in queue as developing countries are important questions to ask. How will actually be distributed? How evenly a vaccine will be distributed? So we don't actually know where we stand, which is kind of a scary thought, but I think there's enough focus and enough, we need more panels like this to highlight important issues that then we can advocate with policymakers and others. And last but not least, my panelist is ZAINAB Khan from UN Women Khyber Pakhtunkhwa office. She's been in the field of humanitarian assistance and project management for over 15 years and has worked on various issues around women's empowerment, legislative reforms, disaster management, human protection, community development, and education. Before joining UN Women, she was part of the Provincial Disaster Management Authority in KP, so has a really good understanding around disasters and humanitarian issues, looking at vulnerable populations. ZAINAB, welcome. I'd like to ask you specifically how climate is affecting women and men differently, and then some examples from 2005 and 2010. What can be done for encountering the more impact on women? What can be done to counter the impact that climate change has on women? And of course, looking at in light of COVID as well. And the landscape around development work whether it's changed and what the context is now. But I'd also like to just remind you, we have 5 to 7 minutes only, because I'd like to open the floor for comments and questions. And those that are participating in this panel discussion, please ask our specialists. You have this opportunity to speak to the specialists. Let's bring out a meaningful discussion here, so that we have something to take forward and food for thought for those that work in this area. So have your comments and questions ready after ZAINAB speaks. Over to you, ZAINAB.
Thank you very much, BENAZIR. And panel members have highlighted some important areas with their valuable inputs. So to start with, it is very important for us to consider that why climate change is disproportionately affecting men and women. Women in developing countries are particularly vulnerable to climate change because they are dependent on the local natural resources for their livelihoods. They have unequal access to resources and very limited role in decision-making processes. In rural settings, women are the ones going out for securing water, food, and fuel for cooking. Overall, taking care of household activities and additional multiple tasks actually face the most challenges. And we do know that several factors account for the discrepancies between women's and men's differentiated exposure and vulnerability to climate change risk. But I will briefly touch 4 areas. So first, gender-based differences in time, use, access to assets and credits, and treatment by markets and formal institutions for the women's opportunities. So as a result, they make very less than what men earn annually. A World Bank survey some time back in 141 countries showed that 103 countries continue to impose legal differences on the basis of gender that may hinder women's economic opportunities. And in addition, 2/3 of the world's 743 million illiterate adults are actually women. So that adds on to the vulnerability. So the cumulative effects of poverty and social, economic, and political barriers is that women will often be disadvantaged in coping with the adverse impacts of the climate change. Due to this existing vulnerabilities that sideline them, they will be more prone to gender-based violence. Second, compared to men, women face huge challenge in accessing all levels of policy and decision-making process. This renders them less able to influence policies, programs, and decisions that adversely impact their lives while making disaster management plans. And I've seen that how much proportion of the women are consulted, not many, for disaster risk reduction activities. How are we ensuring that the gender perspective, that the women are equally involved that the men are? It is important to consider that women as primary responders for devising policies through a participatory approach. And if their participation is not ensured, they will certainly be excluded and denied equal sharing of benefits from natural resources. Third thing is with specific look at the context of South Asia, and it's very important. Socio-cultural norms can limit women from acquiring the information and the skills necessary to escape or avoid hazards. There are multiple levels of activities that are for life-saving techniques. And it is important to consider how accessible they are to the women in our geographical area, how comfortable they will be to get engaged, and how community as a whole will support them in going forward in this direction. So there's a need for the change in the mindset as well. The cultural barriers, dress codes must also be considered. Such social influences render women disproportionately, and it makes them more vulnerable. Fourth, my last one is the lack of sex desegregated data in all sectors, which includes the livelihood, the disaster preparedness, protection of environment, health, well-being. it often leads to an underestimation of women's roles and contributions. This situation can then result in gender-blind climate change policy and programming, which does not take into account the differentiated roles of both men and women. Climate change is threat to peace and security. Less peace, more challenges, more increased human vulnerability. And if there's more increased human vulnerability, we will see that there's an increase in gender-based violence. And while you said something, to quote some examples from the 2005 and 2010, we do know that due to the death of the male family members in many vulnerable households during these disaster timings, women were not able to access the relief services due to their non-registration for the national identity cards. Identity cards for the women are not deemed necessary until required. This is, a social norm that when you ask somebody, they will not take it as a priority. However, it's a very important thing. The data on the beneficiary during these times, the compensation that it's received, it reflected that 10% of the women-headed household were the recipient of these things. And this is a very small number. So how many of the women that are vulnerable and need these assistances then go unnoticed? We do know that during this time, there's like, for example, if we look at the 2010 Pakistan floods, there has been reports of increased early child marriages because there was less, one mouth less to eat for the families. So that's also one of the examples. And there were instances when people fleeing their houses in time of the disasters actually left elderly, a person with disabilities, and some women behind. What needs to be done? There's a need for more research on the subject, improved understanding of women's and men's knowledge. It is important to integrate gender perspectives throughout climate change program in order to effectively address both women's and men's needs. There is a need for sensitization and knowledge building on the subject for the policymaker. And when I'm talking about the policymaker at all levels, you have to start from the top actually. There are some things that you have to take the bottom-up approach, but actually who are the policy makers who are sitting at a highest level? Are they sensitized enough on this subject? That's very important, particularly when we're talking about the gender-based violence. In addition to this, we must ensure that mitigation and adaptation efforts also address sources of gender-based vulnerability and gender inequalities. And lastly, I see that there's a need to engage young pool, girls and boys, in creating grassroots level mass awareness. And how are we doing it? Are we doing it? I don't see this thing happening. There's a lot of population in this age group. And what I see that we are not actually involving them and engaging them to tackle this challenge. That's from my end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ZAINAB. I think you've helped me, made my job easier by summing up actually quite a rich discussion in such a articulate way. So that makes it easier for me not to have to do that. Absolutely. I think what you've said is the inequalities that already existed are actually coming into light. And I think all the thread of this panel discussion has brought that forward, that when you don't invest in certain people, in women, then when there's a time of disaster, whether it be climate or COVID, those inequalities will become stark, will become more obvious. And those vulnerable groups will become more vulnerable, more marginalized, and suffer more than other groups. So the link in both COVID and climate is not, for example, doesn't have a gender lens, but how they are affected, how men and women are affected is very much, is clear. I mean, I think that much we all agree that there is, women suffer differently, women are affected differently than men. So thank you for highlighting, for example, within formal structures and formal opportunities within markets, women already make less. So how is within the climate crisis, but also within COVID, how is that affected? And I think FAUZIA also touched upon that. But more research, improved knowledge, you know, within the South Asian context, that information and the power of information. You know, how we recognize the power of information, but there's such a severe lack of it. So even when we talk about laws for women and the lack of the actual beneficiary knowing what their rights are. But a gender blind approach to climate, I think, is disastrous. So we haven't included women. There are not enough women at the table to talk about climate, which is actually going to affect them more than other groups. You know, so we would think that would be a win-win situation. If you had more women at the table, you'd be able to achieve more results for more people, but we're not seeing that. But again, bringing back basics such as ID cards and how many women and households actually give priority to that. So I think we're still dealing with certain basics before we move forward. What I'd just like to say is, I think we have a lot to lose if we don't address both gender-based violence and the climate change emergency. So how do we do it collectively? Putting our heads together and being more imaginative in our approach. But I'd really like to hear, and I see that from the list of participants, that there are a lot more people who know a lot more about both climate and gender than I could ever possibly imagine to know or have and possess that knowledge. So I'd really like some questions and comments from the floor to kind of bring forward some of the points brought out by the panelists. Who would like to start?
Hi, BENAZIR, can I come in?
Yes,
this is Sana Ikram.
Please just introduce yourself and ask your question or give the comment. Thanks.
Sure. My name is Sana Ikram, and I'm DRM specialist from the World Bank. My question to all the panelists is basically, and whoever wants to respond, that we are talking about this new normal arrangement for some quite long periods of time. We don't know how this COVID situation is going to end. And at the same time, we are facing this emergency of climate change. And at the same time, the gender-based violence is increasing, as we have seen in the reports, in the research, and in the headlines with every passing day. My question is, like, what is the role that local governments can play to improve the awareness or to improve the status quo in terms of reducing gender-based violence and addressing these climate changes and climate shifts and disasters with this with the background of this pandemic? How proactively local governments can play their role? Because we have seen that in all the policies that are relevant to climate change and in all the sectoral policies, there is mention of gender inclusion and more inclusive approach towards attaining the goals that they have mentioned for like various sectors, for example, agriculture, irrigation, or you can name it, or energy. But we see there is huge gap in terms of implementation. There is huge gap. We do not have enough numbers or reliable data available. So what is the role local government, civil society organizations, or what are the real actors that can make some difference at the grassroots level? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sana, for that very important question. I'm glad you asked about local government. Is there someone else that'd like to speak? Because I'd like to take 3 questions and then have panelists very precisely answer the questions because I'm conscious of time. So can I take 2 more questions or comments? Would anyone else like to ask something? So let's just have the panelists answer that. Uzma, can I ask you to answer this question, or perhaps FAUZIA can take this question? Who from the panel would like to answer this?
Sure. Should I go first?
Yes, please, please.
Thanks, Sana.
But please just precise only because of time. Thank you.
Thanks, Sana. I will just very briefly mention that local councillors, they can be trained on gender-based violence. And in fact, Sindh Provincial Commission on the Status of Women, they had done extensive trainings on leadership and gender-based violence for women councillors in Sindh. So this can definitely be done. And the same forum, like I said earlier also, should be used to sensitize the councillors and the other local government structures on climate gender action plans, on how to implement, different climate related commitments that we have. And since it's the most decentralized structure we have, it will help immensely in terms of sensitizing the communities, especially women, because we have women councillors who have better coordination, better outreach to community women, to local village women. So I think this is a very, very effective forum to utilize that. Sorry, I'll just stop here.
Thank you for such a clear.
I will briefly add in.
Yes, Fauzia, please.
Yeah, I'll briefly add in 2 points. I think one is that we need if local governments can set up a minimum number to begin with for the inclusion of women in different activities and initiatives. So that would help ensuring their participation. And second is I will come back to the budget again, because their budget must have a certain percentage that should go to the women related initiatives in particular that would be benefiting them. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Very clear recommendations by both Fauzia and UZMA. Are there any other comments or questions that we would like to ask the panelists? No, then I'll take the opportunity to ask one quick question. Actually, 2 quick questions. Is there someone else? Sorry, do I see someone else raising their? No, okay. If there is, please interrupt me, because I should be talking less. But the questions that I mean, 2 questions. Being a lawyer, having a background of law, is there any legislation in terms of climate that we need in Pakistan? Is there a gap in terms of legislation? Because I know it's often the implementation that's lacking, but really you need the tool to solve the problem. So is there legislation that we require, and what kind of legislation? What would it look like? Being conscious of time, so very clear question, and I'd like a very clear answer, please. And the other is on climate. Do we need a different type of messaging before it gets too late? For example, I think in Bangladesh, we see when things have gotten worse, perhaps climate has become more of an issue with the common person, the ordinary person. Do we need a different type of messaging before things become bad in terms of both gender and climate? And what should that messaging look like?
Can I also ask a question?
Yes, please do. Is this Rabia?
Yeah.
Yes, Rabia,
given
please
the social cultural
introduce yourself and just which organization you're with. Thank you.
I'm from Mountain and Glacier Protection Organization. And my question is, given the social cultural constraint in our society, how we can change the mindset to make gender participation more acceptable in our society?
Thank you. Very important question. I think panelists kind of touched about a little bit upon that, but that would be great if we could expand. But being conscious of time, you don't have long to answer these questions, please. Who would like from the panel to answer these? Zainab, can I ask you to answer Rabia's question?
What I actually did touch upon some of the things. Rabia's question was more on, what strategies can be taken on combating that? Yeah. Did I get it right?
I think you have got it right, yes.
Yes. So I think so it is now, I have also touched it, but I'll say that it brings that from the grassroots level. And there's more need of the sensitization, and there's more need of changing that mindset, because unless, you bring in services, you bring in legislations, you bring in policies, But if there is no acceptability at the receiving end, how will you bring the change? So I think so some focus needs to be done at changing the understanding and working more that gender-based violence has multiple types, and every type is not acceptable, because there are some things that there are, I mean, like there's a more acceptability towards that. However, for example, the psychological one, or the economical one, or within the home environment. So some work needs to be done in this regard. And just taking a bit of more, taking it to the different level, Benazir, you asked about, that what different messages or ways we should adapt in articulating it in a different way. And then you quoted the example of Bangladesh as well. I think so in one of the research that I was looking at, Bangladesh has worked much on aligning its all work with the SDGs achievement, with Sustainable Development Goals achievement. And when your programs and when your policies are aligned with achieving those goals, I think so there will be better results that will be achieved. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that. ZAINAB, can I, and just for 2 minutes, HISKA, can I ask you to come in and adding on to ZAINAB's kind of comments about Bangladesh and actually linking it to SDGs, and that's why it's been more effective. Messaging, you talked a little bit about that. Is there something that we may be missing here in terms of messaging to get the message across? Because again, Rabia also asked, and then ZAINAB also touched upon, there's a disconnect between what's happening on the policy level and what's actually happening on the ground, or the acceptability of that policy. So is there something that is there a gap that we can fill through messaging, and how can we? But again, only 2 minutes, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think what I wanted to add is that we also need to be a bit more innovative in how we message. I mean, we need to use more behavior change interventions. We have some evidence from edutainment and how that has been useful in reducing behaviors that contribute to gender-based violence, and actually have contributed also to reducing the prevalence of GBV. So really bringing in some of these non-traditional actors, these non-traditional ways of messaging. So we know that campaigns, when they are done, they have consistent message, they have targeted audience, and they are done over a period of time, that this actually works. So I think we need to bring in more of that into our messaging and our programming, on both on gender and gender-based violence.
Thank you. That's excellent. I agree with that as well. And I think somewhere we weave in climate, because actually it affects all of us. Like Babar has already said, it's not just about gender, but how do you look at it from a gender lens to make it more accessible to everyone in terms of information and messaging that's innovative, imaginative. Thank you so much for that. Actually, I love to do these moderations. I mean, I'm not sure about online. I prefer face-to-face. So I hope I've achieved what was set out to happen. I see that there is a question, but we're running out of time. Hassan, is that Hassan? Are you attempting to ask a question? No.
Yeah,
okay.
Yes, I was, but it's okay.
Okay, but but only because we're kind of short of time. But if you can ask in a minute and someone can answer in a minute, I'm willing to take it. So
All
if you
right,
can
quick question. Hassan Sapro from Comsats University. Question is that COVID pandemic has shown us that political messaging from all sides actually is undermining many of the activities that we have with respect to whether masks are good, whether we need to do social distancing. Are there examples of gender discrimination that now occurs in political messaging that we need to be more on the lookout for? Thank you.
Can I have a panelist answer that in just one, literally 2 sentences? Can I just ask a panelist HISKA, do you want to answer that? Or Uzma?
I couldn't hear, I don't know if Uzma wants to come in. I couldn't hear the question.
Okay, I'll try to respond to it.
But only in less than a minute, please, Uzma. Thanks.
I think what Hassan asked was that if there are any gender discriminatory messages that are prevalent, which we need to be mindful of. I didn't understand the question, I'm sorry. So I will just try to respond. I think, Hassan, for me, the absence of discussion on gender is more important to see that, in this pandemic discourse, we haven't heard much about gender-based violence, not just in Pakistan, but also globally. And HISKA was also highlighting that. So probably more information. And so this absence is glaring. And we have seen in some countries, like I think in Indonesia, there was some gender discriminatory messaging from the ministry, which they retracted later, which was about, women since they are more engaged in household chores, so they should be the ones shopping for groceries or something like that. So we have to understand, that global pandemics like these, they increase women's household chores, they increase women's unpaid care responsibilities, which in Pakistan's case is already overwhelming. Women are 10 times more involved in unpaid care responsibilities. So a pandemic like this will exacerbate it, and women's exposure to gender-based violence also increases exponentially. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Uzma. I think you've said it for all of us. Yes, I think sometimes silence is actually discriminatory. Not speaking, not having that is actually what we need to address. I won't speak anymore because I'd like to ask Aisha Khan, who's such a passionate activist both on gender and climate, to kind of thank the panelists, thank the participants, and perhaps commit to having more of these, which I'm happy to moderate because I've learned so much and it's been so enriching. Aisha, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, BENAZIR, and I think you've booked yourself for another session by making that commitment. So thank you very much for actually agreeing to moderate this session and doing such a brilliant job of it. And I want to thank all our panelists because I think, the contributions they made, the insights they gave and shared with us were absolutely great. I personally learned a lot because we touched on so many different aspects. It's a very complex issue, and it's multi-layered, and we need to unravel it and address it stage by stage to see that we look at all the different components. And we also got from them some very good recommendations because they've given us key takeaways for policy recommendation that include advocacy, capacity building, making it an integral part of planning, and also budgeting and financing, because like you said, that's where it comes at the end of the day. We make a lot of promises and commitments, but we don't have the financial means to actually see them through. We can't carry them forward. I also liked, the point that was made about the social constraints, because that becomes one of the biggest barriers that we have. We can have all the legislation in place, but if society itself resists change, then it's very difficult to penetrate. And I think we got feedback from our panelists on how to address that issue by bringing it from the bottom up as well as top down, because the involvement of grassroots communities is very, very important. So I want to thank all of you and the audience. I see we had a fairly large number of people who participated. So that also shows the interest level of people on this subject. And we certainly need to have more of these discussions to take this forward. And I think repeating a message and highlighting it also serves a purpose, both in advocacy and in bringing it into the mainstream of public consciousness. So thank you everyone once again for taking out the time, joining us, and making your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, and stay safe, everyone. Khud Hafiz.